Okay, so now it's time to finish up Goldman. So we finished by talking about his objection to medical paternalism because it confuses values. And it was often claimed that health and prolonged life are people's fundamental values. Those are like number one or maybe number 1 and 2 on everybody's preference scale. So doctors are always justified in doing things which will prolong somebody's life, even if it's against their will, because we see that it will satisfy something high up on their preference scale. But as Goldman has shown, that's just not true. Right? Health and prolonged life are not always at the top on anybody's preference scales. We trade off health and prolonged life for all other types of goods. So we can't just make that assumption. Right? Sometimes we trade off the quantity of life for improved quality of life. But now we need to see how this directly applies to medical paternalism cases, right? So some have claimed, obviously we've been dealing with claims like this throughout the last few lectures, that doctors have the ability, moral ability, to hide information from patients because if they gave the patients this information, the patient's going to become depressed, and everybody wants to avoid depression. Depression's bad. But now apply Goldman's reasoning here. Avoiding depression, in the same way as health and prolonged life, all three of those things are not always among our primary motives. Yeah, most of us want to avoid depression, but we don't want to avoid depression at all costs, right? Some things are worth getting depressed over. And so Goldman says, look, in our normal lives, we show this all the time. People suffer frustration and depression in pursuit of accomplishment on a constant basis. And it's because on our subjective preference scale, some of us put accomplishment, put loving relationships, so on and so forth. We put a bunch of these things above the value of avoiding depression. So doctors can't even assume that avoiding depression is number 1, 2, or 3 on our preference scale, right? It could be way down there because we value our relationships or accomplishment more. So doctors are not justified in hiding information from us, right? Even if it's going to cause us to become depressed, because info about our health and treatments may be worth that depression to us, right? There could be, getting that information allows us to exercise autonomy, and exercising autonomy is higher up on our subjective preference scale than avoiding depression. Okay, so here's sort of the big crux of it, right? So Goldman's argument, if you haven't caught on by now, is sort of just a very strong version of the patient knows best type of argument that we've seen a few times now. But it's much stronger, right? It's not just that patients are the best judge of their own interests. It's that everybody's value orderings are so different that the doctor cannot get a grip on it, right? We would normally, we think, okay, well, the doctor can at least assume that health, prolonged life, and avoiding depression are high up on there in the list. But if the doctor can't even assume those things, as Goldman has argued, then they're just going to be lost in the woods, right? Everybody's going to have these drastically different value orderings. The doctor can't make any assumptions about those orderings for their patients. And so the doctor is always highly unlikely to know the patient's value ordering better than the patient. So step back and think about that for a second, right? If there were some fundamental things the doctor could assume were on the patient's preference ordering list, then the doctor could be justified in paternalist actions, right? Because he could end up getting it right. He could end up figuring out what the patient's value ordering is. But given that there are no universal fundamental things that land number 1, 2, and 3 on your preference scale, the doctor's never really going to have a good way of assessing what each patient's value orderings look like. The patient's always going to know that better than the doctor. And so that means whenever the doctor acts paternally, right? Whenever they act against the patient's wishes, the doctor is going to be assuming what the patient's value ordering looks like. And they're going to do that incorrectly, right? They're going to be drastically unlikely to make choices that are actually in the patient's interests. And so acting against the patient's wishes is actually going to cause them harm, right? It's going to harm them because it's going to realize a state of affairs that's lower down on their subjective preference ordering. And this means that paternalism is unjustified. Okay, Goldman does have one final thing to say, and this deals with autonomy's intrinsic value. And this is still an objection to that argument for paternalism, right? The idea here is that, look, self-determination just has really great intrinsic value, right? We can see this just by looking at people's actions, right? So we all value self-determination so much that most of us aren't even willing to give it up when we know that somebody could make a better decision than we could, or at least we realize they're likely to make a better decision than we could, right? So sometimes we realize that we lack the expertise to make the best decision. Somebody else has that expertise, but still making the decision is so personally important to us that we're unwilling to give up our self-determination. So this is supposed to show how great the intrinsic value of self-determination is. In other words, we simply just value the exercise of free choice when it comes to these really personal, important decisions, no matter what the effect of those decisions is going to be. It's just important for us to make these choices. And Goldman, importantly, wants to say this doesn't seem like it's an irrational thing. Right? It doesn't seem like we're being crazy when we do this. It doesn't seem like we're giving too much weight to autonomy. Right? Autonomy really is a fundamental driving factor for a lot of people. So if we can give self-determination that great value, and it's rational for us to keep our self-determination, even when others have the relevant expertise, this says some clear stuff about medical paternalism, right? Medical paternalism is going to be unjustified because decisions over our life, death, and treatment are these types of personally important decisions we would be unwilling to give up, right? Decisions over life, death, and treatment are such fundamental areas in which we desire to exercise our autonomy, that it's wrong for people to step in and act paternally there. Okay, so let's jump into the next author quickly here. This is Terence Ackerman, and he's one of the authors who says that medical paternalism is justified in some cases. And that's because roughly we've been doing it wrong this whole entire time. Right. So a common practice when people are talking about autonomy is just to treat it as a right to non-interference. In other words, we've been saying, look, I respect you autonomously simply when I refrain from interfering in your personal autonomous decisions. Right? It's all about just avoiding interference. That's how I respect you as an autonomous being. But Ackerman wants to say, no, wait, this isn't enough. Respecting autonomy is going to require far more than this. And let's see why he believes that. So first, he's going to give us a definition of what it means to be autonomous. He's going to say autonomous behavior at least has these two key features. Autonomous behavior is governed by plans of action that have been formulated through deliberation and reflection. And autonomous behavior issues, both intentionally and voluntarily, from choices people make based upon their own life plans. So the rough idea here is that we act autonomously when we sit and we think about what we want to have happen, and then we intentionally and voluntarily act on those plans. So if you're missing one of those key characteristics, then you're not truly acting autonomously. Now, there is a worry here about whether or not autonomy requires that we form things through deliberation and reflection, because we need to ask how much deliberation and reflection are required, right? Do we have to sit there and literally comb over every single possibility and deliberate and reflect on every single possibility, risk, so on and so forth, if we're going to act autonomously? Or is it enough if we just simply say, okay, I see this option, I see this option. I don't need to look at them all the way down and inspect every nook and cranny, right? I get the gist of both. I like one instead of two. And is that enough to be autonomous? It's not clear. He hasn't told us, and so this could be a problem for his view later on. That's something you need to think about. But primarily, Ackerman's response to anti-paternalism is to say, look, I agree that autonomy is important, but illness hurts our autonomy. Illness has a transformative power, right? Whenever we're ill, it's going to hamper our autonomy. Right? There are a number of ways that sickness just affects our deliberative capacities. One example is that we become worse at reasoning when we have severe illnesses because they give us anxiety or depression. Right? People who are in terminal states who suffer from anxiety and depression make worse decisions. And it's also really hard for us to act autonomously in medical situations because acting autonomously requires that voluntary bit, right? We have to voluntarily choose an action. But voluntarily choosing an action requires that we're fully informed about it, and most of us just can't understand all of the medical stuff we would need to understand in order to be fully informed about our illness and our treatment. It's just too complicated for the lay person. So it's not clear that we can act voluntarily here because we can't understand everything. And sickness, anxiety, depression all tend to affect our decision-making skills. So in other words, sickness can put these types of constraints upon our autonomy. Right? It can put cognitive constraints because we don't understand all the information or don't have it. Our autonomy can be psychologically constrained because of our anxiety or depression affecting our deliberative skills. There could be social constraints where there are some institutionalized roles or expectations, right? So if you've come from a culture where life is sacred, right? Sanctity of life type of argument, then we need to keep a person's body alive at all costs, right? So there's a social constraint there, right? Your autonomy is being restricted by this cultural expectation. There are also physical constraints to our autonomy, obviously, since our wounded body can't act the way we would choose to act. And so Ackerman says, since all four of these constraints are normally live in medical contexts, our autonomy in medical context is normally greatly diminished. So in order to respect autonomy, we can't just avoid interference, right? Because in this medical case where we're already constrained, all non-interference does is just allow us to exercise whatever autonomy we have left. But we already said our autonomy is diminished, right? So we shouldn't just be sort of respecting somebody's diminished autonomy. We shouldn't just let them act with whatever they've got left. The doctor's moral duty, and this stems from the value of autonomy itself, the doctor's moral duty is to actively try and neutralize all of those constraints or impediments, right? The doctor, in order to respect your autonomy, doesn't just let you choose whatever you want from your restricted capacities. The doctor, in order to respect you as an autonomous being, has to do whatever actions are necessary to restore your full autonomy. And so, if in your hampered state, if you do something or deny some type of treatment that would fulfill your autonomy again, we're allowed to act paternalistically. It's justified. Now, this is going to recommend some certain actions for doctors. It doesn't say you can just do whatever you want, right? It's going to mean that doctors have to always only perform paternalistic actions which are aimed at restoring patient autonomy. Right? So one example could be, in order to respect your autonomy, it's not enough to just give you information, right? It's not enough to try and make you fully informed by just spitting a bunch of information at you. The doctor might have to repeat critical info because you're a patient in denial, or he might have to repeat info or emphasize it in a particular way because you had so much anxiety, you focused on the wrong bits. Doctors might have to influence the beliefs of other people, specifically a patient's parents, who are unfairly impacting the patient's perspective, or they might have to actually alter the patient's belief about the role of being sick in the first place, right? They might have to convince the patient, look, I know you believe that this is all about the doctor deciding a course of treatment, but it's about more than that. It's about the doctor deciding a course of treatment that's also consistent with your values. So you can't just be a passive patient in this scenario. You have to be active. You have to be a co-partner in these decisions that we have to make about your health. In the next one, we'll finish up Ackerman and then move on to Schwartz. Thank you.